right, folks, when I was a kid, my mother used to read fairy tales to me an awful lot. And people don't read those quite as much anymore. One reason is because people see fairy tales on cartoons, maybe on Disney or the Cartoon Network, and they think, oh, I know the story of Cinderella, I saw the cartoon. But the cartoon versions and the actual story themselves are usually very, very different. Fairy tales are oftentimes hundreds and hundreds of years old. There's one fairy tale that is very famous that is actually over 700 years old. And through time, before these stories were actually written down, they were told from one generation to the next. What that means is your grandparents would tell your parents would tell you, and one day you would tell your children, and one day your children's children would tell their children, and so on and so forth, until finally, eventually, someone started to write these down. And since they were told from person to person and generation to generation, sometimes there are slightly different versions of these fairy tales. But they do have certain things in common. We call them elements of a fairy tale. Typically, a fairy tale has royalty. That means kings, queens, princesses, they're going to be in a fairy tale. Another element is talking animals. Another very important element in a fairy tale is good versus evil. You're going to have a good guy going up against a bad guy in a fairy tale. And usually the good guy and bad guy are very easy to pick out. Next, you may have magic. And finally, 3s and 7s are very common in fairy tales. That means something might happen 3 times or 7 times, or there might be 3 of a certain type of character or 7 of a certain type of character. For example, if you've heard the fairy tale Snow White and the 7 Dwarves, or if you've heard the fairy tale The 3 Little Pigs. These are some common elements of a fairy tale. Now, fairy tales may not have every one of these, but they're going to have some of them in order to be a fairy tale. The fairy tale I want to read to you today is one that I loved when I was a kid, even though it was a little bit scary to me sometimes. This fairy tale is Rumpelstiltskin, and I hope that you're going to enjoy this. Once upon a time, there was a miller who had a beautiful daughter. Now, this miller, it just so happened, liked to brag. So he would tell people that not only was his daughter beautiful, but she was also brilliant and talented and skillful. Why, she's so brilliant she can spin straw into gold, he used to say. Now the people who knew this miller knew that he was just a bragging fella, and they didn't believe much of what he said. But there was one person who did. One day, the miller's story made it all the way to the king. Now, this king was a greedy sort of fella, and the thing he loved more than anything in the world was gold. And when he heard that there was a young woman in his kingdom who could spin straw into gold, he knew he had to have her right away. So he sent his guards to take the young woman from her father and bring her to the castle. As soon as she came there, he took her to a room in a high tower that was filled from floor to ceiling with straw. And he said to her, "Spin this straw into gold by tomorrow morning, or I'll take your head." Of course, the girl sat down and began to cry immediately because, of course, she knew that there was no one who could spin straw into gold, and she had no idea what she would do. But as she sat there crying, a small door opened in the wall, and through that door came a wee little man. He was an ugly sort of little man who looked like a troll. And at first the girl was very frightened, but he walked right up to her and spoke very kindly. "Why are you crying, young lady?" And of course she told him the whole story. And when she did, he smiled, a sort of cunning little smile, and said, "I can help you, but if I do, what will you give me in return?" Immediately, the young lady thought about the necklace that she'd had from her mother. And even though it was one of her most prized possessions because her mother had passed away and left it to her, she knew her mother would want her to give this necklace up in order to save her life. So she took it from her neck and gave it to the wee little man. He walked over to the spinning wheel that the king had left. He picked up a handful of straw and whir, he spun it through the spinning wheel and out came solid gold thread. He did this all night long until finally the next morning there was nothing left but heaps and piles of gold thread. The king came in, opened the door, and was thrilled beyond belief. Now you might would think he would be satisfied, but he was a very greedy sort of man. So he took her to another room, even bigger than the first, packed from floor to ceiling with nothing but straw. And he said to her the same thing as before. If she could spin the straw into gold before morning, then well and good. But if not, he would have her head. Because now he was convinced she could really do it. And immediately, of course, as soon as she was alone, the girl sat down and began to cry. Because now she was truly hopeless. The king thought for sure that she could do what he was asking, and he would have no mercy on her if she failed. But just as she was about to lose heart completely, a little door opened in the wall, and out stepped the same wee little man who had visited her the night before. "Oh, dearie, why are you crying?" he said to her. And of course, again, she told him the whole story. And his eyes shone with a almost wicked sort of gleam. And he smiled in a cunning way and said, "I can do it for you, dearie. But what will you give me?" She'd given up her necklace the night before, but she noticed she did have one little ring that her father had given to her when she was 13 years old. And even though the ring wasn't worth very much, it was all that she had left, so she offered it to the little man, thinking he probably would turn her down. But to her surprise, he did not. He accepted the ring from her. He grabbed a handful of straw, went over to the spinning wheel, and whir, spun a spool full of solid gold thread, just like he'd done the night before. He worked all night long, and just as the sun was coming up, he finished. Before the king came in, of course, he darted back out the little door. The king threw the door open and was amazed beyond belief. And you might think he was satisfied, but he was not, for he was a greedy man. But he had also begun to think it might be good to have a wife who was as beautiful and talented and skillful as this young miller's daughter was. So this time he made a slightly different deal with her. If she could spin another room full of straw into gold before morning, he would marry her and make her his queen. Now you might think that the girl would be excited about this, but she felt more hopeless than ever before when he took her into an even bigger room that was stacked and piled and stuffed with nothing but straw and a spinning wheel. There was so much straw in there they could barely even fit her into the room. But of course they shoved her in, shut the door, and left her. And just like before, she sat down and began to cry, because now she was completely hopeless. Not only did she realize the king would be furious with her if she failed, she had nothing left to give to the little man, even if he did come back and offer to help her again. So she sat down and began to cry. But lo and behold, guess what happened? A little doorway in the wall opened up, and in stepped the little man. The woman noticed this time he looked very confident and proud and even a little sinister. He asked her, "Dearie, do you need help again?" And of course she replied that she did, but she told him, "I have nothing left to give to you." And then he smiled, a very cruel sort of smile, and he said to her, "I'll spin all this straw into gold, and I only ask one little simple thing from you in return." The girl couldn't imagine what it would be that the little man would want that she could possibly give to him. But she listened, and he said to her, "I'll spin all this straw into gold if you'll promise to give me your first baby as soon as it's born." And of course the girl stepped back in terror and shock and fear. How in the world could she be expected to give her own child to this cruel little man? But then she thought to herself, I might not even have a baby. And if I don't make this deal, then I'm sure to lose my head, because the king will be furious with me for sure. So against her better judgment, she agreed. And the little man smiled more widely than he had smiled at any time before. He sat down, he pulled up a handful of straw, stuck it into the spinning wheel, and then whir, 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 out came a spool full of solid gold thread. And he kept working all night long, spinning spool after spool of solid gold thread. The next morning, just before dawn, he finished. He crept out through that secret door, and in walked the king. He was thrilled beyond belief, and even though he was a very greedy man, at long last, he felt satisfied with the gold that he had acquired. So, the next day, he and the miller's daughter married. And for a year, they were as happy as they could be. And then, the queen found out she was going to have a baby. And she was rather frightened, but she thought to herself, I'm the queen now. There's nothing that little man can do to me anymore. And besides, it's been a year. He's probably forgotten all about the agreement that we made. In a very short while, the queen had her baby, her firstborn child, a son. And he had yellow hair that was as shiny as the gold that the little man had spun for her. And she was happy for a few days, until one day, into her room came the little old man. And he smiled and said, Well, Queenie, I've come for the baby. Remember our deal? And of course, she stepped back in horror and fear. And there was no way she could give her child to this little man. So she begged and she pleaded and she promised him gold and jewels and silver and anything he could possibly want if she would just be allowed to keep her baby. But he just smiled and said, Remember, Queenie, a deal is a deal. But after a few more moments of her tears, he decided to make one more deal with her. He said to her, If you can guess my name in 3 days, the baby is yours. But if not, I'll take him. And of course, there was nothing she could do except this deal, so she did. The little man left, and immediately she began making a list of every single name she'd ever heard. She started with A's: Abel, Abner, Albert, Angus, and she went all the way through to the Z's: Zephaniah, Zedekiah, Zechariah, every name she could think of. And the next day, when the little man came, she spent all day reading that list, and every time she called out a name, he would smile and say, That's not my name. This went on all day, and the little man left. So the next day, she called all her servants, all her maids, all her friends, and asked them to help her think of names. And they wrote down every name they'd ever heard of, every ridiculous and silly name that had ever been thought of, like Ramshackle and Rabnicon and Rathbound and Abnacadabna, and anything they could think of. And as soon as the little man came back, she read all of those ridiculous and silly names to him. And each time he just smiled his little smile and said, That's not my name. By the third day, she was desperate. And she told all her servants and all her husband's knights to go all throughout the kingdom and find anyone they could and ask them what was their name and what names had they ever heard of. And they did this all day long. And just before the little man came back, one of her servants arrived. And he said to her, This may sound strange, but I was riding out through the woods. And as I was headed back to the castle with my long list of names, I saw a fire in the distance. So I rode toward the fire thinking surely there must be someone there and I'll ask for his name. But as I rode closer, I saw that around this fire danced a little old man, a strange looking, curious figure. And as he danced, he sang to himself, Hi diddle dee, the queen's baby will belong to me, for never will she guess or never will she think that my name is Rumpelstiltskin. So her servant wrote the name down and rushed back to the castle and gave it to her. And even though he admitted it was probably ridiculous, it was another name that she could try at least. So that night, when the little visitor came back, the queen began calling out the list of names once again. She called out names like Abraham and Isaac and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and every name she could possibly think of. And each time the little man would smile and look at the baby with greedy eyes and say, "No, that's not my name." So finally, he said to her, "Well, we had our deal, and now the baby's mine." But just as he reached toward the child, the queen said, "Wait, I did think of one more name, and it's silly, it's probably not yours, but I could try it anyway, right?" So he laughed and said, "Go ahead, Queenie, try again." And so she said, "Your name isn't, by any chance, could it possibly be Rumpelstiltskin?" And the little man shrieked and screamed and said, "The devil told you, the devil told you." And he stomped and he stomped and he stomped his feet until he stomped right through the floor of the castle, and the ground swallowed him up, and they never saw or heard from him ever again. And the king and the queen and their son, the prince, lived happily ever after. The end. Now let's look at our elements of the fairy tale and see, did we find any of these? First of all, did we see any magic? Yes, spinning straw into gold would take magic. Did we see any 3s or 7s? Well, we saw 3 nights that the little man came, 3 things she had to give to him, the necklace, the ring, and then the baby. We saw 3 different rooms. We saw she had 3 days to guess his name. Did we see good versus evil? Yes, that wicked little man Rumpelstiltskin versus the queen who was trying to keep her baby safe. Did we see royalty? Yes, we saw a king and queen and a prince. And did we see any talking animals? No, in this case we did not. We did see 1, 2, 3, 4 elements, but we didn't see the 5th one. So, when you're reading something that you think is a fairy tale, and a lot of times the clue is going to be things like once upon a time and happily ever after, look for these elements. See which ones you can see. Tomorrow we'll read a different fairy tale and see if we can find these same elements in it. Thank you, folks, and have a good day. Bye.